People have attachments to places they live. Some people have lived in the same place their entire lives, and that community is all they know. Others have moved around, but have a longing to return to the community where they grew up. Our communities are places that comfort us through familiarity and family. Sometimes, though, the community becomes a battlefield. In 1994, the Florida legislature held a hearing to discuss the merits of a bill seeking reparations for the survivors and descendants of the small black community of Rosewood. Opponents of the bill claimed that it would set a dangerous precedent, the famed slippery slope that we hear so much about when people don't want something to happen. Others said that the bill wasn't necessary because the events that happened in Rosewood were typical at the time. We shouldn't have to help the victims because completely destroying a community of people based on their race was typical. Oh, why didn't you say so? No, the horrific acts carried out in Rosewood in 1923 completely crippled the futures of everyone who had been living happily at the time. The people were healthy and prospering, and an attack drove them away from their homes, away from everything they owned. They were forced to flee to an unknown area with nothing, some changing their names out of fear. They had to completely start their lives over, and any prosperity they had was gone. They were starting over at square one, and that meant that their descendants would be starting with less than they would have had if the residents of Rosewood had just been left alone. The Florida legislature was rightly open to hearing the case, but they needed details of exactly what had happened on those fateful days in January, 71 years prior. There was little on record about the attack. Maybe it was because, sadly, those events were typical. They didn't garner a lot of news, and not many people thought to record what happened. Fortunately, though, this travesty hadn't happened so long ago that there were no witnesses. Rosewood was settled in 1842 near the Gulf of Mexico. The settlement was a mix of white and black residents, and the local economy drew on the timber industry. Nearby pencil mills were the largest employers, but when most of the cedar trees in the area had been cut by 1890, the pencil mills closed, and many white residents moved to the nearby town of Sumner. By 1920, Rosewood's population of about 200 was entirely made up of black citizens, except for one white family that ran one of the two general stores. The town of Sumner was predominantly white, and relations between the two communities tended to be amicable. 22-year-old Fannie Taylor was a white woman living in Sumner in 1923. She was married to 30-year-old James Taylor, who worked as a millwright, and the couple had 2 children together. James's work required him to be up and gone when it was still dark, leaving his wife and children alone at home. On January 1, 1923, Fannie's neighbor claimed that she heard screaming and ran to the Taylor home to investigate. The neighbor found Fannie covered in bruises and claiming a black man had entered the house and assaulted her. She told the neighbor to check on her baby because the man was still in the house, but the neighbor found the infant unharmed and nobody else was inside the house at the time. The incident was reported to Sheriff Robert Elias Walker, with Fannie specifying that she had not been raped. There was a woman from Rosewood named Sarah Carrier who washed clothes for the white families in Sumner. Years later, Sarah's granddaughter, Philomena Goines, said that she had gone with her grandmother to the Taylor home that morning, and they saw a white man leave the house not long before noon. She said that Fannie did appear with bruises that day, but it wasn't until afternoon. They had seen the white man at the house on other occasions, and it's believed that Fannie was having an affair. Some people have posited that she and her lover got into an argument that morning, and the man beat her. She concocted the story of the black intruder as a means of keeping the affair a secret from her husband. Unfortunately, at that time in history, A lie like that wouldn't just simply be shrugged off. Despite having no way of knowing who the intruder was, the residents of Sumner would ensure that the black community paid the price. The United States as a whole was a hotbed of racial tension in the 1920s, but when it came to lynchings, Florida was one of the leaders. Lynchings were the execution of a person, in this case a black person, for an alleged offense without a trial. Many of these offenses weren't even crimes, but minor social transgressions. Between 1877 and 1950, there were 311 lynchings on record in the state of Florida, which makes it the state with the second highest amount of lynchings per capita, with Arkansas being the first. Many of the victims of lynchings were merely accused of a crime that there was absolutely no evidence that they had committed. Others were simply there to have the finger pointed at them when the real perpetrator was unknown. To make matters worse, recent events in nearby areas had increased the tension. On December 2, 1922, a school teacher named Ruby Hendry was found shot with a shotgun and her throat slashed in Perry, Florida. Her face had been beaten so badly that her identity wasn't immediately known. The shotgun that was conveniently left on the scene was linked to a black man named Charles Wright, who was an escaped convict. When Charles wasn't immediately located, the white residents took the crime out on the entire black community. They spent the next few days burning down buildings that served the black residents. On December 6th, Hubert Dixon, a black man returning home, was stopped and told to put his hands up by armed citizens who had been deputized by the sheriff. Hubert was shot and killed when he allegedly did not comply, and witnesses said it looked like he was reaching for a gun in his back pocket. When his body was searched, he did not have a gun, only a closed pocket knife. On December 7th, a black man named Albert Young was arrested and said to be an accomplice of Charles's. The next day, Charles Wright was arrested and then reported to have confessed to murdering Ruby Hendry. It's been said that Charles was actually tortured until he confessed to the crime. The same day, a crowd of 3,000 to 5,000 white men stopped the transportation of the prisoners and took them for trial in a kangaroo court. Charles was determined by the mob to be guilty and he was burned to death. Albert was returned to the sheriff, but a few days later he was abducted and shot to death by a smaller mob. Then, on New Year's Eve, the Ku Klux Klan held a highly publicized rally in Gainesville. Their presence intensified the fear that was already palpable amongst the white residents. Fannie Taylor's husband, James, escalated the situation by gathering an angry mob of white citizens to hunt down the culprit. He also called for help from white residents in neighboring counties, which brought in about 500 Ku Klux Klan members who were in Gainesville for the rally. The white mobs prowled the area woods, searching for any black man they might find. Law enforcement found out that a black prisoner named Jesse Hunter had escaped a chain gang and immediately designated him a suspect. The mobs focused their searches on Jesse, convinced that he was being hidden by the black residents. Levy County Sheriff Robert Elias Walker asked for dogs from a nearby convict camp, but one dog may have been used by a group of men acting without Walker's authority. Dogs led a group of over 100 men to the home of Aaron Carrier. Aaron was the nephew of Sarah Carrier, who had worked at the victim's house. Aaron was taken outside, where his mother begged the men not to kill him. He was tied to a car and dragged to Sumner. Sheriff Walker put Aaron in protective custody at the county seat in Bronson to save him from the men in the posse, many of whom were drinking and acting on their own authority. Worried that the group would quickly grow further out of control, the sheriff also urged black employees to stay at the area's turpentine mills for their own safety. Another mob showed up at the home of blacksmith Sam Carter, torturing him until he admitted that he was hiding Jesse Hunter and agreed to take them to the hiding spot. He led them into the woods, but when they didn't find Jesse, someone in the mob shot Sam. His body was hung on a tree before the mob moved on. As the violence escalated, about 25 people were in the home of Sarah Carrier. They were mostly children who were hiding upstairs under mattresses. On the evening of January 4th, armed white men surrounded the house in the belief that Jesse Hunter was hiding there. Shots rang out in the ensuing confrontation, and Sarah was shot in the head and killed. Her son Sylvester was also killed by a gun wound. The standoff lasted long into the next morning, where Sarah and Sylvester were found dead inside the house. Several others were wounded, including a child who had been shot in the eye. 2 white men, Polly Wilkerson and Henry Andrews, were also killed. Polly was reported to have kicked in the front door, and Henry was behind him. They were both shot and killed upon entry into the home. At least 4 white men were wounded, one possibly fatal. The remaining children in the Carrier house were taken out the back door and into the woods. They crossed dirt roads one at a time, then hid under brush until they had all gathered away from Rosewood. News of the standoff at the Carrier house spread, with newspapers inflating the number of dead and falsely reporting bands of armed black citizens going on a rampage. The Miami metropolis listed 20 black people and 4 white people dead and characterized the event as a race war. National newspapers also put the incident on the front page. The Washington Post and St. Louis Dispatch described a band of heavily armed Negroes and a Negro desperado as being involved. Even more white men poured into the area believing that a race war had broken out. Of course, black newspapers covered the events from a different angle. The Afro-American in Baltimore highlighted the acts of African-American heroism against the onslaught of quote-unquote savages. Another newspaper reported, quote, 2 Negro women were attacked and raped between Rosewood and Sumner. The sexual lust of the brutal white mobbists satisfied, the women were strangled. Some of the first targets of this influx were the churches in Rosewood, which were burned down. Houses were then attacked, first setting fire to them and then shooting people as they escaped from the burning buildings. Lexi Gordon was one of those murdered, taking a gunshot to her face as she hid under her burning house. Lexi had sent her children fleeing when the white attackers approached, but suffering from typhoid fever, she stayed behind. Many Rosewood citizens fled to nearby swamps for safety, spending days hidden in them. The survivors recalled that it was uncharacteristically cold for Florida, and people suffered when they spent several nights in raised wooded areas called hammocks to evade the mob. Some took refuge with sympathetic white families. Sam Carter's 69-year-old widow hid for 2 days in the swamps, then was driven by a sympathetic white mail carrier, under bags of mail, to join her family in Chiefland. James Carrier, brother of Sylvester and son of Sarah, did manage to get out of the swamp and take refuge with the help of a local turpentine factory manager. A white mob found him anyway and proceeded to torture him for information about Jesse Hunter. They eventually forced him to dig a grave for himself before shooting and killing him. Armed guards sent by Sheriff Walker turned away black people who emerged from the swamps and tried to go home. Governor Carey Hardy was on standby, ready to order National Guard troops in to neutralize the situation. Despite his message to the sheriff of Alachua County, Sheriff Walker informed Hardy by telegram that he did not fear further disorder and urged the governor not to intervene. The governor's office monitored the situation in part because of intense northern interest, but Governor Hardy would not activate the National Guard without Sheriff Walker's request. The sheriff insisted he could handle the situation, and records show that Governor Hardy took Sheriff Walker's word and went on a hunting trip. You know how it is when you're the governor and there's a mob of white people killing black people in your state? Nothing to cancel your hunting plans over. John and William Bryce were brothers who owned a train, and they used it to evacuate some of the black residents to Gainesville. The brothers were independently wealthy Cedar Key residents who had an affinity for trains. They knew the people in Rosewood and had traded with them regularly. As they passed the area, the Bryces slowed their train and blew the horn, picking up women and children. Fearing retaliation from the mobs, they refused to pick up any black men. Many survivors boarded the train after having been hidden by white general store owner John Wright and his wife Mary Jo. Over the next several days, other Rosewood residents fled to the Wrights' house, facilitated by Sheriff Walker, who asked the Wrights to transport as many residents out of town as possible. Lee Ruth Davis, her sister, and 2 brothers were hidden by the Wrights while their father hid in the woods. A few days later, Lee and her siblings crept out of the house to hide with relatives in the nearby town of Wiley, but they were turned back for being too dangerous. The children spent the day in the woods but decided to return to the Wrights' house. After spotting men with guns on their way back, they crept back to the Wrights, who were frantic with fear, not knowing what had happened to Lee and her siblings. Gainesville's black community took in many of Rosewood's evacuees, waiting for them at the train station and greeting survivors as they disembarked, covered in sheets. Mobs began to disperse after several days, but on January 7th, many returned to finish off the town, burning what little remained of it to the ground, except for the home of John Wright. Today, that house and a memorial sign are all that's left of a once thriving community. A special grand jury and prosecutor were appointed by the governor to investigate the violence. The jury heard the testimonies of nearly 30 witnesses, mostly white, over several days, but claimed to not find enough evidence for prosecution. With the violence over, the surviving citizens of Rosewood did not return, fearful that the horrific bloodshed would recur. The village remained unoccupied, and the sound of angry mobs turned into deafening silence. The survivors who left Rosewood had to start over with nothing. That meant that earning money became more important than education. Even the children had to take on work to make ends meet, which put them at an increased disadvantage. The residents of Rosewood were said to be prospering, and the white mobs became even more angry when they arrived at the town and saw that some of the residents were doing even better than they were. The village was a place where black families were able to earn a decent living and the children could focus on their education, but the destruction of Rosewood took that all away. The adults who survived refused to talk about the events. They were afraid that if the people where they lived found out who they were, another angry mob would come after them, so over time, what happened in Rosewood faded away. In 1982, an investigative reporter named Gary Moore from the St. Petersburg Times drove from the Tampa area to Cedar Key looking for a story. One thing that Gary was interested in was how the town of Cedar Key, along with the nearby town of Sumner, had become 100% white. When he commented to a local on the gloomy atmosphere of Cedar Key and questioned why a southern town was all white when at the start of the 20th century it had been nearly half black, a local woman replied, quote, "I know what you're digging for. You're trying to get me to talk about that massacre." Gary knew nothing about a massacre, but when he heard this, he was immediately hooked. Gary met with a young man named Arnett Doctor, who was the son of Philomena Goines. If you remember, Philomena was Sarah Carrier's granddaughter and went with her to work at Fannie Taylor's house on the morning of January 1st, 1923. Despite the survivors being tight-lipped about the attack in Rosewood, eventually Philomena told her son about it. Gary was able to convince Arnett to join him on a visit to the site, which he did without telling his mother. Gary addressed the disappearance of the incident from written or spoken history, saying, quote, "After a week of sensation, the weeks of January 1923 seemed to have dropped completely from Florida's consciousness, like some unmentionable skeleton in the family closet." A year later, the story about Rosewood appeared on 60 Minutes, and though many of the survivors remained in denial, it fueled Arnett to seek some kind of justice for what had happened to his mother and his extended family. It took until 1994 for the Florida legislature to hear the case for reparations, but even being open to the possibility made it evident that the racism of 1923 was far from gone. Some legislators began receiving hate mail, some of which was signed by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Still, they moved forward, hearing from a number of descendants of Rosewood, as well as a clinical psychologist who said the survivors would have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Another expert testified about the scale of the property damage. After the hearing, it was decided that the state of Florida had a moral obligation to make restitution to the former residents of Rosewood. In the winter of 1994, the Florida legislature passed the bill, and Governor Childs signed the Rosewood Compensation Bill, a $2.1 million package to compensate survivors and their descendants. 7 survivors and their family members were present at the signing to hear Governor Childs say, quote, "Because of the strength and commitment of these survivors and their families, the long silence has finally been broken and the shadow has been lifted. Instead of being forgotten, because of their testimony, the Rosewood story is known across our state and across our nation. This legislation assures that the tragedy of Rosewood will never be forgotten by the generations to come." 9 survivors who lived in Rosewood at the time of the attacks were compensated, and a number of their descendants also applied for smaller sums. The Florida Department of Education set up the Rosewood Family Scholarship Fund for descendants of the residents of Rosewood to assist in pursuing their education. In 2004, the state of Florida declared Rosewood a Florida Heritage Landmark and erected a historical marker. The official death toll is 8, 6 black and 2 white, but the real number may never be known. Some witnesses claimed that up to 27 black residents were killed. Others claim that many more than 2 white people were also killed that day. The initial news reports did not accurately detail the deaths, and the real numbers have been lost to time. When you think back to your hometown, remembering the times you spent as a child or the events you celebrated with your family, just remember that not everyone's hometown still exists. Some have been destroyed by hatred and violence, and the memories of the community have died with the residents that once called those places home. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week where we'll take you somewhere sinister.